portrayals of witchcraft records can be very amusing. Almost everything that was known at the time about witches was pure fiction, invented by church authorities, who were told that witches were a threat, and so had to come up with something to describe. Their creations have passed on into popular cultural images of witches, which continue to this day. Very little of people's understanding of witches has anything to do with older, pagan traditions which supposedly were the source of witches and witchcraft. Most clerics seem to have been rather limited in creativity, so witches were shown as behaving a simplistically opposite fashion from Christians. Since Christians kneeled, then witches stood on their heads when paying homage to their masters. Communion was parodied by a black mass. Catholic sacraments became excrement. One of the most famous symbols of the Inquisition's witch craze was the publication of the Malleus Maleficarum, or Witch's Hammer, by Jacob Sprenger and Heinrich Kramer. These two Dominican monks wrote a lurid account of what witches were really like, and what they really did, an account which would rival modern science fiction in its creativity, not to mention its fictitiousness. It's not too far from the truth to suggest that Sprenger and Kramer were early propagandists, creating a fake resource for authorities in order to help justify what the authorities wanted to do all along. Sprenger and Kramer told religious leaders what they wanted to hear, and helped make it easier for those leaders to pursue the persecution of witches throughout Europe. The political and religious goals set down by the church leaders were deemed far more important than the consequences to their own values, principles, or morals, and certainly more important than the possible persecution of anyone who might actually be innocent of the charges leveled against them. Christians in medieval and pre that Satan was a real being, and that Satan was actively involved in the affairs of humans. Satan's goal was the corruption of humanity, the destruction of everything good, and the damnation of as many people as possible in hell. One means by which it was believed he accomplished this was through human agents to whom he gave supernatural powers. Witches were easily categorized as servants of Satan. No longer merely adherents to a more ancient religious tradition, witches were targeted for prosecution as slaves of the cosmic enemy of God, Jesus, and Christianity. Instead of a healer or a teacher, the witch was made into an instrument of evil. The witch was portrayed and treated as worse than a heretic. This tactic was not limited to the medieval church's pursuit of witches. Religious and political authorities of various eras and different cultures have always found it convenient to associate their enemies with the worst possible evil they could imagine. In the Christian West, this generally meant associating enemies with Satan. These sort of extreme demonization allows a person to stop seeing their enemy as entirely human, and the conflict as something which does not require mercy, traditionally just procedures, or anything of the kind. The only just outcome is not merely the defeat of one's enemy, but their complete extermination. In a battle where one's very existence is at stake, survival becomes the only moral value worth upholding. It was believed that part of the rite of becoming a witch in Satan's service involved kissing Satan's rear. It should be remembered that insofar as there existed anyone who practiced the healing and divination techniques of older pagan traditions, they wouldn't have had anything to do with Satan. After all, Satan is a creation of Christianity and monotheistic traditions. Any witches who existed were pantheists or polytheists and wouldn't have believed in a Satan. Persecuting witches and persecuting women. The subservience of women to men was a common theme in early Christian writings, an outgrowth of both traditional patriarchal attitudes and the extreme hierarchical nature of the church itself. Groups which did not hold to hierarchy in any form were attacked immediately. There is no shared authority between the genders in traditional Christianity, either in the church or in the home. Homosexuality would be particularly threatening to this ideology, as it raises the potential of redefining gender roles, especially in the home. Witness how the recent attacks upon homosexuality in society has progressed hand in hand with the mindless promotion of vague, traditional family values, particularly those which put women in their place and reinforce male dominance in the home. With a married couple of two women or two men, who exactly is supposed to be in charge and who meekly obedient? Never mind that the Christians will never be asked to make those decisions themselves. The mere fact that people are making such decisions on their own, rather than obeying someone else's religious proclamations, is quite enough to give them fits of apoplexy. The perception of women as inferior to men, and possibly The enemy of proper religious or social order has survived down through this day in the most conservative and fundamentalist religious movements around the world. Religious institutions and doctrines are a primary repository for ancient beliefs about the social, physical, political, and religious inferiority of women. Even if the rest of society is moving on and improving women's status, religion remains the main source of beliefs and attitudes which retard that progress in the hopes of reversing it completely. And, where women cannot be attacked directly, they are attacked indirectly, through negative stereotypes about feminine values, as compared to positive stereotypes of manly or masculine traits. It would be a mistake to assert that the Christian persecution of witches and witchcraft was nothing but an attempt to suppress women and feminine influences. Christian society, politics, and theology, at the time, simply weren't that simplistic. At the same time, it's hard to overestimate the role of misogynistic attitudes and repressed male sexuality played in the persecution of witches. It seems likely that if they didn't exist, the extreme violence directed at women and alleged witches probably wouldn't have occurred. Witches, misogyny, and patriarchy, clerical torture of women. The persecution of witches reached its zenith at a time when Christianity's attitudes against sex had long since turned into full-blown misogyny. It is amazing how celibate men became obsessed with the sexuality of women. As it is stated in Malleus Maleficarum, all witchcraft comes from carnal lust, which is in women insatiable. Another section describes how witches were known to collect male organs in great numbers, as many as 20 or 30 members together, and put them in a bird's nest. Evidently, they were not entirely stingy with their collections. There is the story of a man who went to a witch to have his lost penis restored. She told the afflicted man to climb a certain tree, and that he might take which he liked out of a nest, in which there were several members. And when he tried to take a big one, the witch said, "You must not take that one," adding, "because it belonged to a parish priest." And some people say that really wishful thinking. These sentiments were nothing unique or unusual. Indeed, they are a result of centuries of mean-spirited, sexual pathology on the part of church theologians. The philosopher Boethius, for example, wrote in the Consolation of Philosophy, that woman is a temple built upon a sewer. Later, in the 10th century, Odo of Cluny stated, "To embrace a woman, is to embrace a sack of manure." Women were regarded as impediments to true spirituality and union with God, which helps explain why investigators focused on women more than men. The church had a long-standing prejudice against women, and this was given vent when the doctrine of devil worship was emphasized as an enemy, which the church had to confront and destroy. This animus hasn't entirely disappeared, even today. Women aren't persecuted and tortured, but they are deliberately kept out of positions of authority and responsibility, reserved exclusively for men. Under torture, accused witches would confess to almost anything. Confessions of witchcraft, extracted under torture, or threat of torture, commonly came attached to denouncements of other possible witches, keeping the inquisitors in business. In Spain, church records tell the story of Maria of Iturin, admitting under torture that she and sister witches turned themselves into horses and galloped through the sky. In a district of France, 600 women admitted to copulating with demons. Some entire villages in Europe may have been exterminated. Although the children of heretics and Jews had never experienced much in the way of mercy from inquisitors, the children of convicted witches suffered even more horribly. These kids were themselves prosecuted for witchcraft. Girls after the age of 9.5, boys after the age of 10.5. Even younger children could be tortured to elicit testimony against parents. A French judge is reported to have regretted being so lenient when he sentenced young kids to be flogged while they watched their parents burn, instead of sentencing them to burn as well. Children may not be easily culpable for heresy or their parents' heresy, but they could certainly be influenced by, or even possessed by Satan. The only hope of saving their souls was to torture their bodies to drive out the satanic influences. Voluntary testimony from someone as young as 2 could be admitted despite it not being treated as valid in other cases. This was a sign of just how serious the threat of witches was perceived to be. Witches and witchcraft, both of which were in the service of Satan, threatened the very existence of Christian society, the Christian church, and Christians themselves. Normal standards of justice, evidence, and trials were abandoned because no one wanted to take the chance that respecting traditional rights and standards would allow the guilty to escape punishment. How the torture of witches, suppression of inquisitors. Interrogations of witches followed many standard Inquisition procedures, but with some added bonuses. Accused witches were all stripped naked, had all of their body hair shaved off, and then pricked. The sexually neurotic Malleus Maleficarum had become the standard text on how to deal with witches, and this book stated authoritatively that all witches bore a numb devil's mark, which could be detected by sharp prodding. Inquisitors were also quick to search for the purported witches' tits, blemishes, which were supposed to be extra nipples used by witches to suckle demons. Red-hot tongues were applied to women's breasts and genitalia. Researcher Nancy Van Vuren has written that the women's sex organs provided special attraction for the male torturer. It should not be surprising that just about every torture victim eventually confessed. Effectiveness of sexual torture. When people are tortured, and especially when the torture involves sexual abuse, it doesn't take long for the victim's world to become reduced to nothing but the pain, and a desire for the pain to end. When the only important thing is the cessation of pain, the victim will tell the torturer whatever they want to hear. It may not be the truth, but if the pain ends, that's all that matters. Blaming the victims of sexual torture. If the men interrogating the witches were to become aroused, it was assumed that the desire originated, not in them, but instead was a projection from the women. Women were supposed to be highly sexually charged beings, while the celibate inquisitors were supposed to be beyond such matters. Of course, the women were expected to admit that they were causing the interrogators to become sexually aroused, leading to a new round of questions and possible torture. Sex and interrogation of witches. If witches and witchcraft had become imbued with an identity that reaches far beyond their own existence, if they have become a symbol for something larger, for Christians, then what are they a symbol of? It seems to me that witches served a symbolic role for the male, celibate religious authorities in Europe. Witches were not simply adherents to an alternative religiosity, and they certainly weren't turning whole towns into toads. Indeed, most of those accused of witchcraft almost certainly weren't guilty of anything of the sort. Instead, their treatment at the hands of men, and the rationales used by those men, indicate that the oppression of witches was somehow symbolic of the oppression of women, in general, of women's sexuality, and of sexuality in general. I hate to sound Freudian, but I really do think that in this case, the assertions by celibate men about the alleged sexual obsessions of witches are really a clear case of projection. If women, sexual are actually responsible for the priest's sexual desires, then the priests could in turn still feel holy, and better yet, holier than thou, more righteous, and holy than the hated women around them. When one group is systematically persecuted by others, and especially when the persecutors deliberately abandon normal standards of justice, procedures, and so forth, then it's important to look at whether the persecutors are just reacting to a perceived threat, real or imagined, or if they are instead reacting to something larger, and using the victims as a scapegoat for larger fears. Sometimes both may be at work, too. Executing witches and eliminating witchcraft. Burning and hanging were the most popular forms of execution for accused witches in medieval Europe. Burning seems to have been most common in continental Europe, while hanging was more common in Britain, and thus also in the American colonies later, as well. The death penalty was imposed on a wide variety of crimes in this era, but witchcraft, in particular, was punished by death on the basis of Exodus 22:18. Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live, and Leviticus 20:27, a man also or woman that hath a familiar spirit, or that is a wizard, shall surely be put to death, they shall stone them with stones. The heretics, who were the earlier targets of the Inquisition, were almost never executed, at first. They typically had a chance to repent, and submit to the church. Only after relapsing into heresy, did they generally become subject to execution. Even then, they might still be given another chance to repent. Witches received almost the exact opposite treatment. The execution was typically applied after the first accusation, and only rarely were accused witches allowed to go free after repenting. This helps demonstrate the level of threat which the church made out of witches and witchcraft. Witches couldn't be allowed to live, no matter what, not even if they were willing to admit all that they were accused of, and fully repent. Their evil was too much of an existential threat to Christian society, and they had to be completely excised, not unlike cancer, which has to be cut out, lest it kill the entire body. There was simply no tolerance or patience for the witches. They had to be eliminated, whatever the cost. Some have claimed that as were executed as witches, even though few could possibly have been truly guilty of witchcraft, and that because this represented a deliberate attempt to kill women generally, it should be dubbed a women's holocaust. More recent research demonstrates that many accused witches were men, not just women, and that number of those executed is far lower. Estimates today range from 60,000 to 40,000. Even if we are especially pessimistic, we probably can't go higher than 100,000 people killed across all Europe, and over an extended period of time. That's obviously very bad, but not quite a holocaust. Not quite a holocaust.